Hey everyone, it's Corona from the Headphone Show. Today we're going to be talking about the Beyerdynamic DT 770 Pro. Let's check it out. Okay, so the DT 770 Pro. This is a headphone that's been around for a very long time, and I really feel as though it doesn't need much of an introduction. However, to get some of the simple stuff out of the way, a DT 770 Pro today will set you back around $150. So I would classify this as being a very or relatively affordable, hi-fi or audiophile headphone. And what you get is a closed-back dynamic driver headphone powered by the same DT driver that's found in both the DT 990 Pro and the DT 880 Pro, I believe. So even though those are very different sounding headphones, they all use the same driver technology. Now, the reason why I make this video is because recently, due to other content that I've been working on, I've actually been listening a lot to the DT 770 Pro. And I realized that I never actually covered it or reviewed it. And looking back on my audio experience, it's probably the headphone, the hi-fi headphone that I've been listening to for the longest. So some of you might know that my first review, or at least my first video review, was of the 2020 LCD2. So the phaser version, not the Razor, the phaser version of the LCD2. And the year before that, what I had been using as my daily driver was a DT 770 Pro. And the reason for that, as hopefully you'll understand by the end of the video, is that it had a lot of qualities that suited both my audio needs and preferences. Now, before we get started, I just want to clarify that the DT 770 Pro that I'm filming with today is an 80 ohm version. Now, I have tried the 215 ohm version of the DT 770 Pro, but honestly, there was almost no audio differences that I could notice, at least on the source equipment that I was using. And the other thing is that the one I have with me is actually a newer one. So this is not the one that I owned years ago. That one I gave to a friend. This is one of the newer versions. I bought this 2 months ago, but it sounds pretty much the same. So if you see it has some of the newer branding, that's the reason why. But anyways, we'll get started by talking about the accessories. And well, for accessories, there really isn't much to cover here. I mean, you get the DT 770 Pro, a bit of paperwork, and you also get a Beyerdynamic travel baggie. Moving on to build and comfort, I've always been a really big fan of the build and design of these DT headphones. For $150, you're getting one of the most durable feeling headphones that you can probably get out there. So they're not the most premium looking, but they're basically built like tanks. And there's really, aside from the ear cups, which are made of plastic, as well as these bits towards the ends of the headband, pretty much everything else on this headphone is made out of metal and feels incredibly solid. Now, even though it has a lot of metal components, this is actually an extremely light headphone at 270 grams. So not quite as light as things like the HD600 or HD650, but it's definitely one of the lightest headphones on the market. Now, if there's a few things that I have to flaw about the build, the first one and the more prominent one is the cable. So the cable is non-detachable, and this is really the only element on the headphone that I can see as being a common source of failure. Everything else I've never run into issues with. So on all the DT 770 Pros that I've had or tried, no issues with the hinges or loosening up or anything like that. Occasionally the text on the ear cup fades away a little bit, but I mean, that's purely aesthetic. Everything else remains fully functional throughout the entire time. And then the other thing is the pads. So the pads, these tend to wear down quite a bit, similar to what you experience on Sennheiser HD600 series headphones. So after 6 to 8 months, they flatten out quite a bit. You'll probably have to swap them out, as basically by the end of that time period, your ears will basically always be touching the driver, and that greatly also affects the sound of the headphones. So if you want to keep them feeling new and sounding the same as when you got them, you'll probably want to swap the pads out every 6 to 8 months. And I believe that those are available on Beyerdynamic's website. But moving on to comfort, as I mentioned earlier, this is a very light headphone. So as far as weight, I think most people will find that to be not a factor for fatigue. And the other thing is that although the clamp force is a little bit tight out of the box, I find that they do tend to ease up quite a bit after the first week, or if you can't wait, something that I do is I just like bend the headband a little bit. And that makes them a lot easier to wear. Although, again, during that first week, they do tend to be a little bit clampy. But aside from that, they're super comfortable. The velour material that they use on the pads is easily some of the best out there. It's just, they're basically like ear pillows. But anyways, let's now talk about sound, which I think is the DT770 Pro's biggest strong point. Now, when I think of headphones around the $150 mark, I think of things like the AKG K371, which is also a closed back, or the HD58X from Sennheiser, the one made in collaboration with Drop, or like the HE400 SE from Hi-Fi-Man, although I guess it's a little bit cheaper. And, you know, for me, the technical performance of the DT770 Pro far outshines any of those headphones that I mentioned, and I would deem it closer in performance to something like the HC600 series headphones from Sennheiser, or something like the Hi-Fi-Man Sundar. So headphones that are in the $200 to $300 range. So you're getting a lot of performance for a headphone that's $150. And, you know, it has a V-shaped tuning, which is not the kind of tonality that I normally gravitate to. And yes, I usually, or well, actually always, because I always EQ all my headphones, I always use the DT770 Pro with EQ. But even without it, it's a headphone that I can really enjoy without the need for any tweaks or modifying or anything, because even though it is a V-shaped tuning, it's surprisingly balanced sounding. So you have very well defined and pronounced bass. You also have accentuated highs, but they're not aggressive. And something that really stood out to me was that the mids somehow still managed to be quite present. And there's a very good mid-range tuning here. And well, without giving too much away, let's get into why that is. And we'll start off by talking about the bass. The first thing that stands out to me on the bass response for the DT770 Pro is that it has fantastic extension. So all the way down to 20 Hertz, I really couldn't notice any roll off. So you're getting a lot of depth and rumble in those really low sub-bass frequencies. And this is also aided by the fact that, yes, this headphone has a boosted bass shelf. So you get under around, I'd say like 120 to 130 Hertz. You get a few more dB than what would be suggested by the 2018 Harman target curve. Then as you move into the mid bass, there's actually a mid bass bump. So it's a fairly narrow band. It's like between, it sounds to me as though it's like maybe 130 to like 180 Hertz at most. So you do get a bit of like an extra mid bass kick and warmth added there to the mix. But what's really nice about the bass on the DT770 Pro is that the bass shelf and the mid bass bump settle before 200 Hertz. So you're not getting any muddying or anything like that as the bass transitions into the lower mids. So while you get a bass response that is, you know, boosted for my preference and over what Harman would suggest, it's actually a very enjoyable bass response that feels actually quite clean. It's not messing with any other frequency registers. And the other thing that I wanted to point out is that for a headphone in this price bracket, the driver here handles low tones really well. They're quite articulate and precise, more so than on something like the HD600 and HD650. Now, as for the mids, as I mentioned earlier, they don't really feel subdued despite this headphone having an overarching V-shaped tuning. And there's not much for me to say here. The mids here are linear throughout. They feel very natural sounding. They have a very good timbre to them. The only thing that I did notice, and this was only really noticeable after using EQ on the headphone, so when like EQing down the treble, was that there is a little bit of a dip at around 4K, so like the upper mid-range can be lacking just a tiny bit of presence, but this wasn't as noticeable when I was just listening to a headphone with its stock tuning. But so aside from that, this is a really great tuning. This is what I would consider to be like a reference mid-range tonality. It reminds me actually quite a bit of that of the HD600 and the HD800's mid-range tuning specifically. Lastly, for tonality, we have the treble, and of course, Beyerdynamic is infamous for the treble tuning on most of its headphones. I think that it's fair to say that for a lot of listeners out there, Beyerdynamic is synonymous with sibilance. And you know, the treble on the DT770 Pro does feel like it's artificially brightened, or like a little bit, and it does have a tiny bit of sibilance as well. But unlike other Beyerdynamic headphones, like for example the DT990 Pro, which has this really narrow frequency band at around 8.5K that just spikes by seemingly in excess of 10 dB, the DT770 Pro is not a headphone I describe as being harsh or fatiguing to listen to. And the reason for this is because even though it does have a peak at 6K, the elevation itself is not like a really slim narrow band like on the DT990. It's actually a really broad elevation. So from like 5.5 to around 8.5K, you have this elevation in the treble that does make like the lower treble and mid treble sound a little bit brighter than you'd expect. So just a little bit more than what would be like, let's say, harmon neutral or like natural sounding, at least to me. But it makes it a bit more subtle. And it doesn't make any one frequency band stand out like on those other Beyerdynamic headphones. And it does add a little bit of like a tiny bit of like low treble sibilance and glare, but it's quite subtle. And actually most of the sibilance, the only thing that I found like it could add a bit of like hiss or like a sizzle to like consonant sounds, was that they're on top of the 6K like broad elevation, there does seem to be a narrower peak at around 8.5K. But again, this is subtle and nowhere near as aggressive as, you know, as I'd expect it to be. So even if I was listening to this headphone without EQ, I found the treble to actually be pretty good. It's very enjoyable, not very fatiguing unless like you're extremely treble sensitive. And another thing that I noticed was that for a closed back headphone in this price bracket, it's one of the ones that has better upper treble extension, so you do get some nice air qualities above 10K as well. So overall, even if you don't EQ this headphone, I actually think that the treble tuning here is pretty good for a V-shaped headphone. Moving on to technical performance, let's first talk about resolution. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in my opinion, the DT770 Pro is, for technical performance, really closer to something like the HT600 or HT650 or other slightly more expensive headphones. So even though it comes in at an entry-level price point, you're really getting very good value and performance out of this headphone. So it creates a very pristine image of the music. Then as for soundstage imaging and layering, I've always been a very big fan of the soundstage presentation that Beyerdynamic headphones have, and that is of course no exception with the DT770 Pro. And you know what's really impressive is that I can't think of any other closed back headphones aside from the HT820, the Verite closed, and the DT717 Pro, 1770 Pro that really have as good a soundstage presentation as the DT770 Pro. And the reason for it is because it has a very spacious soundstage that creates a very good sense of distance despite being a closed back headphone. So it doesn't really feel at all close in or intimate like something like, let's say, the Aeon 2 Noir, which I really love. And the other thing is that it has extremely precise imaging. In fact, one of the things that I've always liked about Beyerdynamic headphones is that they have imaging that feels to me as precise in terms of their positioning and directionality as something like my HT800S, and I feel like I'm not exaggerating when I say that. In terms of directionality and how well you can discern the positioning of sound, I feel like they're up there with the HT800S. Where they do kind of lack a little bit of performance is actually in instrument separation and layering. For some reason, they just don't seem to like have as much spatial depth for the instruments and vocal lines in each track as something like an HT600 or even like a HT58X. It's just something that the driver and the Beyerdynamic headphones don't seem to do for me. But for soundstage, the soundstage, the size and the imaging, they're some of the best you can get. And that's also why I really love them for gaming, as one of the main reasons why I got them. One more thing to note, since this is a closed back headphone, is that these have excellent passive noise isolation. So really, when I put these on, they're basically like gun range earmuffs. I can't even hear my own keyboard. And the only other closed back headphones that I've tried that reach this level of noise isolation are the DT1770 Pro and the Verite Close. So if you are in a noisy environment and you really just want to focus on your music or whatever you're monitoring, these are great for that application. I feel like I haven't said this in a while, but like I mentioned earlier, I like to use EQ with all the headphones that I buy and all the headphones that I review. So I've made a custom EQ preset for the DT770 Pro, and if you want to check that out, there will be a link in the description down below to a post I've made on the headphones community forums, which has all of my EQ presets, including the one for the DT770 Pro. So if you want to try it out, check the description. But anyways, now to wrap up this review on the DT770 Pro. You know, it's a headphone that even after all these years, I find to be really impressive, especially when you take into consideration its price point. I know that the V-shaped tuning won't be for everybody, but the way that it's executed on the DT770 Pro, I find to be quite tasteful and very enjoyable. And the technical performance here, I really feel rivals headphones that are in, twice its price range. And one thing that I wanted to mention is that I have tried a lot of the more expensive offerings in Beyerdynamic, like the 1770 Pro and the T5P. And honestly, I'd still take the DT770 Pro over them. I don't feel like they offer anything in terms of their tonality or technical performance that really warrants spending 3 to 5 times the price that you would on the DT770 Pro. And actually, now that I think about it, I would probably take the DT770 Pro over any of the open back headphones from Beyerdynamic. So I guess that for me, in my opinion, the DT770 Pro is Beyerdynamic's finest offering yet. So needless to say, it gets a very strong recommendation from me. I mean, it's a very comfortable headphone, very good tonality, very good technical performance, also very durable. And the fact that it's closed back makes it very versatile. So if you're looking for like a solid closed back headphone under $1,000, there's very few other headphones that I'd actually recommend aside from maybe the Nora or the Celestis. So I definitely recommend that you check out the DT770 Pro. Okay, so that is all for me today. I hope you enjoyed this video or found it useful. If you did, do consider dropping a like. If you'd like to learn more about the DT770 Pro or many other headphones, I highly encourage you to check out the review section available on headphones.com. For more headphone and audio content, stay tuned by subscribing to The Headphone Show here on YouTube, and until next time, this is Chrono signing off.